I rented the cabin because it was cheap and far enough out in the woods that I could shut everything out for a weekend. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, no other houses close by, only a gravel road that ended in front of it. The place looked simple but decent. Wooden porch, one window looking out toward the trees, and the smell of pine everywhere in the air. Inside, it was what you'd expect for the price. Old furniture, uneven floors, wood paneling on the walls, and the faint odor of dampness that seemed to cling to cabins that sat empty most of the time. I walked through the rooms to get a feel for the place. Living area in the front with a small couch and a beat-up coffee table. Kitchen to the side with mismatched plates and mugs left in the cupboard. 2 small bedrooms, and a short hallway that ended with another door. That last one caught my eye right away. It was shut tight and covered with heavy wooden boards nailed across it from top to bottom. The nails were thick and uneven, hammered in deep. Whoever had sealed it wanted to make sure it stayed that way. At first, I thought maybe it was just storage or some kind of utility closet. But the way it was boarded made it stand out. I pulled out my phone and texted the cabin owner, who I had been messaging earlier about the key. The reply came back quick. "That room has water damage. Keep it sealed." Nothing more, no explanation, no extra detail. I stared at the words for a while. It seemed odd. Usually if there's water damage, you just lock the door or put up a sign. You don't go out of your way to nail thick boards across it like you're keeping something inside. Still, I brushed it off. I wasn't there to overthink things. I dropped my bag in one of the bedrooms, set up a small fire in the fireplace, and tried to settle in. The evening was quiet. The forest outside seemed calm. No wind, no sound but the occasional bird. As it got darker, the silence grew heavier. The cabin seemed too still. It was around midnight when I first heard it. Faint sound like scratching. At first I thought it was some animal outside on the wall or maybe a branch rubbing against the siding. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was coming from inside, from behind that nailed door at the end of the hall. I sat up on the couch and held my breath. The scratching was slow, uneven, like nails dragging lightly on wood. It would stop, then start again, then drag down in long strokes. I told myself maybe it was mice. Cabins like this always had rodents. But the sound was too loud, too deliberate, not the quick scurry of mice. It felt like something bigger. After a while, the scratching stopped, but then came another sound. A slow, dragging noise, heavy, as if something was being pulled across the floor on the other side of that sealed room. I sat frozen, my ears straining. The dragging moved a bit, then went quiet. My chest felt tight with unease. Out of a kind of nervous impulse, I walked slowly down the hall, each step making the floor creak under me. When I reached the boarded door, I stood close, listening. It was silent now, but I couldn't shake the pressure in the air, like something was on the other side listening to me too. Without thinking much, I knocked lightly, just once, maybe out of some foolish curiosity. Almost right away, something tapped back. Just a single knock, faint but clear. My stomach turned cold. I stumbled back from the door and stood there in the hall, staring at those boards. My pulse was racing. I went back to the living room, shut off the small lamp, and just sat in the dark with only the faint glow of the fire. Every little sound in the cabin set me on edge. The walls popped and groaned, which was normal for old wood, but now it all felt wrong, like the place was breathing around me. I barely slept that night, dozing in and out on the couch. When I woke in the gray morning light, the first thing I did was check the door again. My stomach dropped when I saw some of the boards weren't the same as before. A couple at the bottom looked bent outward, like something had pushed against them from the inside. The nails were pulled halfway free. I crouched down and touched the wood. It was rough, splintered at the edges where pressure had been applied. I stood there trying to make sense of it. I thought about leaving right then, throwing my bag in the car and driving off, but some part of me wanted to understand what I had seen and heard. Maybe there were squatters. Maybe the owner had locked someone in there, someone desperate enough to claw at the boards during the night. The thought made my skin crawl. The whole day, I kept circling back to the door. I'd sit in the living room, then walk back to check it again, half expecting it to be wide open. It stayed closed, but I couldn't get out of my head the image of someone inside, crouched in the dark, waiting. I didn't hear any sounds that day, just silence pressing in. When night fell again, my nerves stretched thin. I left the lamp on this time, too uneasy to sit in darkness. Around 1 in the morning, the scratching returned. Slow at first, then more urgent, dragging nails hard enough to make the wood shudder. My throat was dry, my palms sweating. The dragging sound came again too, heavy, deliberate, and closer than the night before. I couldn't sit still. I crept halfway down the hall before stopping. The sound on the other side went quiet. The air felt charged, like whoever or whatever was in there knew I was standing outside. My mind raced through explanations. A trapped animal? Person locked away? Some dangerous squatter hiding? Every option felt worse than the last. I barely slept again. By dawn, I had decided I was leaving. I packed my things fast, not even bothering with breakfast. Before stepping out, I forced myself to look one last time at the door. The boards were even looser now. 3 of them near the bottom had been pushed almost free, hanging crooked, only held by bent nails. There were dark marks around them, smudges that looked like dirt or grease, maybe from hands pushing through. That was enough for me. I left the cabin key on the table, locked the front door, and drove out of there without looking back. My chest didn't unclench until I saw the highway. On the drive home, the owner texted me asking how the stay was. I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to. I kept replaying the tapping sound that came after I knocked, the way the boards bowed out as if something stronger than me was trying to leave. And the worst part wasn't knowing what it was. The worst part was the thought that if I had stayed another night, those boards might not have held. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. When I finally looked the cabin up again, it was gone from the listing. No trace, no photos, like it had never been there. But I still see it in my head. The crooked boards, the faint marks on the wood, and the heavy silence of something waiting behind it. And I know I'll never rent a place like that again, not after realizing how close I came to finding out what someone wanted nailed shut. I rented the cabin because I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. It was a small place up in the mountains, a single-story wooden cabin tucked against a slope with tall pines on all sides, the kind of place that looked like a picture on a postcard. Smoke curling from the chimney, a wooden porch with 2 chairs, a little stone path leading down to where a stream cut through the trees. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my bag, and right away noticed how still it felt. No cars, no voices, just the occasional wind through the trees. Inside it smelled of pine boards and old wood smoke. The cabin had one main room with a wood stove, a couch, a small kitchen area with a fridge and stove, and a bedroom off to the side. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and had everything I needed. On the coffee table was a little stack of board games, a few old paperbacks, and a guest log bound in dark leather. I'd seen those before in vacation rentals, where people signed their names and wrote little notes about their stay, but this one was thicker, filled with decades of pages. The cover was worn soft from all the hands that had opened it. That first night after making dinner, I sat on the couch with the log in my lap and started flipping through. The early pages were cheerful. Families from the 70s and 80s talking about how peaceful the place was. Couples doodling hearts around their names. Kids scribbling little drawings of trees or campfires. It was charming in a way, like the cabin had this long chain of people who had all come here before me, enjoying the same quiet. But as I went further, I started to notice odd entries. Some were written in shaky handwriting, uneven and hurried, as if the person had been writing in the dark. A note from the early 90s said, "Don't stay past midnight." Another one just said, "Please leave," underlined several times. There were pages where the lines weren't filled with stories about hikes or fishing, just jagged scrawls of words that didn't seem to finish, warnings about noises, or "Someone's outside." At first I thought maybe people were joking, trying to scare whoever came after them. What really unsettled me, though, were the dates. I noticed that a couple of the warnings were dated the day after the guests had supposedly checked out. One man wrote, "We left early. Not safe here. Don't trust the night." with a date that didn't make sense because the log showed another family checked in that same day. It didn't add up, but I tried to brush it off as maybe a mistake or someone messing around. That night, I built a fire in the stove, read a little, and went to bed. Nothing happened. The woods were quiet. The wind moved now and then against the walls, but it wasn't anything unusual for a mountain cabin. By morning, it felt silly to have even been uneasy. I made breakfast, sat on the porch with coffee, and went for a short walk along the stream. Later that day, though, I caught myself thinking about the log again. When I came back inside after the walk, I picked it up and went through more pages. Mixed in with the normal happy notes were these scattered entries that seemed out of place. Pleas for help, words written so fast they tilted off the lines, names signed with shaky letters. The handwriting looked different from the neat cursive and block letters of all the other entries. One page from 2008 said, "They know I'm alone here." Another from 2012 just had the words, "Don't answer," written across the entire page. I didn't know what it was supposed to mean. By the second evening, I was restless. The woods seemed thicker, darker, more cut off than they had the day before. I double-checked the lock on the door before bed, even though I had never worried about it before. The bed was comfortable, the blanket heavy, but I kept waking up. Around 2 in the morning, I came awake and knew something was wrong before I even sat up. The fire had gone out. The cabin was dark except for a faint glow from the moon through the window. The air felt colder, heavier. I noticed the guest log wasn't on the coffee table where I'd left it. It was sitting on the floor halfway between the table and the couch. I don't remember moving it. I told myself maybe I'd knocked it off without realizing, but the way it lay open bothered me. I got up, crossed the room, and bent down to pick it up. The pages were open to a fresh entry. My name was written across the top in big letters, the date marked as that very day. Below it, in handwriting that wasn't mine, was a long paragraph. The words blurred together at first because my hands shook when I read them. The writing described me by name, said I had come alone, said I had flipped through the book at night, said I had locked the door and still felt unsafe. It ended with, "Don't go outside." I stood there frozen. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even touched the book since earlier that afternoon. I stared at the letters, traced my name with my finger, but the pressure of the pen was there. The ink fresh enough that it hadn't even sunk fully into the paper. Whoever wrote it knew things only I knew. I went around the cabin checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing was broken. The woods outside were silent. No crunch of footsteps. No car. No voices. I stayed awake for hours, sitting in the chair by the stove with the log on the table, just staring at it, waiting to hear something. Nothing happened. Eventually, the dark outside shifted to gray and then to light. When the sun rose, the fear felt different, more confusing than anything. I kept going back over it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been inside before I came. Maybe they wrote it and left the book open on purpose. Maybe it was just some sick joke left for the next guest. But my name was in it. My name, the date, details about me being there alone. I packed my bag not long after sunrise. I couldn't relax in that cabin anymore. Every sound made me think someone was outside, waiting, watching. I set the book back on the table, closed, and didn't look at it again. Before leaving, I walked the outside perimeter of the cabin. There were no footprints in the dirt except mine. No sign that anyone had been around at all. The drive back down the mountain was slow. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car following, or someone standing by the side of the road watching me. There was never anyone there. When I got home, I thought about calling the rental company, telling them what I'd found in the log, but I didn't. I didn't want to explain it because I didn't even have an explanation for myself. The memory stuck with me though, the way the letters looked, pressed into the paper. My name written by a hand that wasn't mine, on a date that matched the morning I opened it. The fact that whoever wrote it knew I would be awake in the dark, knew I would read it, and told me not to go outside. I never went back to that cabin. I never rented another place with a guest log either. Even now, when I think about it, the detail that bothers me most isn't the message itself, but the fact that I don't know when it was written. I had been awake most of the night, the cabin silent, the book closed when I last saw it. Yet somehow in that same time, a page appeared filled out with my name and words describing me in the present tense. It left me with the uneasy feeling that maybe the warnings in those other entries weren't jokes. Maybe the scribbles and the dates that didn't match weren't mistakes. People before me had written pleas for help, told whoever came next not to stay past midnight. I ignored them, and then the book wrote me into its pages like it had done with them. Leaving that morning might have been the only reason I never had to write another entry myself. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up to the cabin was how quiet the woods were in winter. Snow stretched across the ground in an unbroken blanket, pressed smooth by the wind. The trees stood still, no leaves, only bare branches that rattled softly when the air moved through them. The cabin was old but solid, made of dark logs, with smoke stains above the stone chimney that showed it had been used for years. I was looking forward to the silence, the kind of weekend where you cut yourself off from everything. Just you, the cold, and a fire to keep it at bay. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. The walls were lined with shelves and a few old hunting prints, and the floor was wide planks that creaked if you stepped wrong. There was a fireplace taking up most of one wall, blackened brick and a heavy iron grate. That was what I cared about most. The temperature had dropped the second I shut the door behind me, and I knew I'd need that fire going constantly if I wanted to sleep without my breath freezing in the air. Behind the cabin there was a small shed, rough boards nailed together, its roof sagging under snow. Inside, stacked from floor to ceiling, was firewood. Thick logs, some split clean down the middle, some just rough-cut rounds. Piles of kindling, bark, sticks. Whoever stocked it had done a good job. I carried in enough for the night, stacked it neatly by the hearth, and built up a roaring fire that had the cabin warming within an hour. I cooked some food, sat back with a blanket, and listened to the popping of the wood. By the time I went to bed, the fire had died down to embers. I remember pulling the blanket tight around me, hearing the faint wind against the walls, and letting the warmth from the stones behind the fireplace ease me to sleep. The first morning, when I stepped out of bed, I noticed the wood pile inside was smaller. I thought I had just used more than I remembered the night before. The fire was down to smoldering coals. No surprise there. So I put on my jacket and boots and went back to the shed for more. I filled my arms and carried it in, chalking up the missing pieces to my own forgetfulness. The day passed quietly. I walked around the woods, kept to the frozen trail, heard only the crunch of snow beneath my boots. The sky stayed gray all day, and by late afternoon I was already back inside. I built the fire high again, letting it roar, the flames stretching up, and I made sure to bring in more wood than I thought I'd need. I wanted it ready for the night so I wouldn't have to step outside in the dark. The second morning, I woke up shivering. The fire had almost gone out, just a weak glow left. That wasn't what caught my eye, though. The wood pile inside the cabin was smaller again. Much smaller. Logs gone, sticks gone, even some of the bark pieces I had stacked neatly. I stood there staring at it, trying to work it out in my head. I knew exactly how much I had carried in the day before, more than enough to keep it fed through the night. It didn't add up. I went outside to check the shed. The snow was disturbed around it, tracks pressed deep, but they were messy, uneven. Could have been animals, I thought. A raccoon, maybe even a bear if they hadn't bedded down yet. But the tracks looked dragged out, long marks in the snow, not clean prints. It unsettled me. Still, I hauled more wood inside, stacked it, and tried not to think about it too much. That night, I made the fire bigger than before. I sat close to it, watching every log burn down, feeding it carefully, making sure I had control of it. I didn't want to be cold again. I kept glancing at the wood pile by the hearth, counting without meaning to. When I finally lay down, I told myself it would be fine. The third morning, the wood pile was half gone. Half of what I had carried in was missing. I sat up in bed, staring at the empty space where the logs should have been. My stomach turned. I knew now it wasn't me forgetting, and it wasn't just the fire consuming more than I thought. Something was taking it. I checked the back door. The snow there was trampled down, messy, like something had been dragged across it. I noticed something else too. My boots, which I had left by the door the night before, were gone. Just gone. I searched the cabin to be sure I hadn't moved them without thinking, but they weren't anywhere. The tracks outside showed drag marks leading into the trees. That was when I decided I wasn't sleeping the next night. I brought in as much wood as I could carry, built the fire huge, and sat by it with the lantern lit. I stayed wrapped in a blanket, but my eyes stayed on the door. Hours went by, the logs burned down, the wind outside rose and fell. I heard cracking noises in the woods, maybe branches breaking under snow. Around midnight, the fire settled into glowing embers again. I fed it carefully, but I didn't close my eyes. Just before dawn, when the cold felt sharper than ever, I heard it. The back door creaked. It was slow, as if someone didn't want it to make noise. I froze in place, heart hammering, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor. The door opened wider, and I heard the scrape of wood on wood, the sound of the last few logs being dragged off the pile. It wasn't footsteps, not really, more like shuffling, something heavy sliding over the floor. I leaned forward just enough to see. In the dim glow of the fire and lantern, I caught the shape. Not an animal, a man. Thin, bent over, wearing layers of ragged clothing, face hidden behind a mess of hair and beard. His hands were wrapped in rags, and he clutched the logs to his chest, struggling with their weight. He turned, and I saw my boots dangling from one arm, laces tied together. He moved awkwardly, stumbling a little, dragging everything toward the open door. I didn't move. I sat frozen as he slipped out into the darkness, the door groaning shut behind him. For a long time I just sat there, listening to the wind, the fire popping, my own breath shaking. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped outside. The drag marks in the snow were fresh, leading away from the cabin, out into the woods. They went straight back into the trees, weaving into the shadows where the pines grew thick. I followed for a short way, but my feet were already numb in just socks, and the cold bit deep. The marks continued deeper out of sight. It hit me then. Someone had been living out here probably all winter, taking what he needed to survive. Firewood, boots, anything to keep himself alive in the snow. He must have been watching the cabin for days, slipping in at night, careful not to wake me. I went back inside, shut the door, and locked it. I spent the last day in that cabin feeding the fire with what little I had left, wrapped in blankets, waiting for morning when I could leave. Every sound outside made me tense. Every creak of the wood made me think of him creeping back. But he didn't return while I was there. When I packed up and left, I didn't look behind me. The woods were silent again, but I knew he was still out there, hidden somewhere among the trees, surviving off what he could take. I drove away with the thought that I had only seen him because I stayed awake. If I had kept sleeping, he would have kept coming night after night until there was nothing left to burn. And I realized, out there in the cold, survival pushes people to do things that feel worse than any ghost story. The storm came in faster than any of us expected. By the time the last bit of daylight drained out of the sky, the wind was already howling through the trees like it wanted to tear the cabin apart. Snow was slamming against the windows hard enough to rattle the panes, and the roof groaned under the weight of it. We had talked about coming out here for weeks, just a few friends, a long weekend, and no distractions. The cabin was small, nothing fancy, just a single main room with a wood stove, a little kitchen, and a sleeping loft above. It had seemed perfect when we first arrived, tucked so far back in the forest that the nearest road felt like miles away. But with the storm closing in, it didn't feel perfect anymore. Felt like a trap. The power died not long after dark. 1 second the overhead light was buzzing faintly, the next the whole room dropped into blackness. Only the glow from the wood stove cut the dark. We lit a couple of candles we had packed just in case, but it didn't do much against the heavy shadows. The storm outside swallowed all other sound. No birds, no creaking trees, just the endless pounding of wind and snow. We pulled our sleeping bags close to the stove and sat in a circle, the orange light flickering across tired faces. We didn't have an endless supply of firewood, so we kept the flames low and steady, only adding a log when the heat began to fade. The food situation wasn't great either. We had brought enough for a weekend, but with no power and no way to leave, we realized quick that we needed to make it last. Cans of soup, some pasta, a little bread that was already starting to go stale. The air inside grew heavy and close. Every time someone opened the door, even a crack to check outside, a burst of cold shot in like knives. The snow was already piled halfway up the doorframe, and it was still falling heavier and heavier. We were locked in tight, nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the storm's rage. Hours passed in that slow, dragging way that only comes in the middle of the night. Nobody really slept. The wind hit the walls in bursts that shook the whole cabin. At some point, one of us said we needed more snow to melt for water. It made sense. We had been using the pot on top of the stove to melt it down, but it never lasted long, and the air was so dry from the heat that we were drinking constantly. One of the guys shifted like he was about to get up, but then stopped, shaking his head. The cold out there was brutal, and opening that door would drop the inside temperature in seconds. We all sat quietly, letting the thought fade, deciding we could stretch what little we had for now. Time blurred. The storm raged harder, rattling the cabin until it felt like the walls might crack. I was staring at the stove when I heard it, the sound of a voice, faint, muffled, carried on the wind from outside. It was one of our friends' voices, clear enough that I recognized it instantly. It wasn't just some random sound twisted by the storm. It was their voice, calling out from the woods, not far from the cabin. At first I thought I imagined it. I looked at the friend I thought I heard, and that's when I froze. They were sitting right there, not even a foot away from me. They hadn't moved. Their face was pale in the glow of the firelight, and their eyes were wide, staring back at me. They whispered. They hadn't said a word. I believed them. I could still hear the echo of their voice out there, faint but clear, like they were lost in the dark trees and calling back toward the cabin. No one moved for a long time. We all just sat there, listening, waiting to hear it again. And then it came, louder this time, but still muffled, as if the storm itself was carrying it. The same voice, the same tone. It was wrong. My skin crawled, and my stomach sank. Every part of me knew what I was hearing, but it didn't make sense. The fire popped, making us all flinch. The wind slammed against the walls, the cabin shaking around us, but all I could focus on was that sound outside. Something was out there, and it knew us well enough to copy one of us perfectly. I kept thinking about the way it had sounded, desperate, like someone calling for help. That was the worst part. If I didn't know my friend was sitting right next to me, I would have gone out there without thinking. We stayed huddled by the stove for the rest of the night, the air heavy with fear. No one spoke much. Every so often the voice would come again, sometimes close, sometimes farther, always the same tone, always the same words that we couldn't quite make out. We didn't open the door, not once. When morning finally came, the storm had slowed. Snow was piled high against the cabin, but the wind had eased enough that the silence felt crushing. I forced myself to open the door, shoving hard until the snow gave way. Cold air rushed in, biting at my face. The world outside was white, endless drifts and broken tree branches buried under ice. I stepped out and scanned the woods. There were no tracks in the snow. Not from a person, not from an animal. Just smooth, untouched drifts stretching into the trees. Whatever had been out there, if anything had been out there, it left no sign. We spent the rest of the day digging paths, trying to keep the cabin from being completely buried. The silence of the forest pressed down on us. Every time I paused, I caught myself straining to hear that voice again, but it never came back. The storm had cut us off for another 2 days before we finally managed to reach the main road. When we left, the cabin stood quiet behind us, just another shadow in the trees. We never talked much about what happened that night, but I haven't forgotten it. I can still hear the way the voice carried through the storm, familiar and wrong at the same time. I don't know if it was the wind or something else using the storm to trick us, but I know what I heard. and I know it was real enough to keep us inside, huddled together, too afraid to move. When people ask about that trip, I tell them about the storm, about how we almost ran out of food, how cold it got. But I never tell them the part that really stays with me. The sound of a friend's voice calling from the woods when they were sitting right next to me. The kind of sound that burrows deep into your mind because it doesn't leave you with answers, only questions. And out there, in the middle of nowhere, questions like that are worse than any storm. The drive to the lake was longer than I thought it would be. The road narrowed to gravel about 20 miles before the cabin, and from there it was nothing but trees and silence, the kind that makes you turn down the music without realizing it. The rental listing had shown a neat little cabin with a deck that overlooked a wide lake, and that was exactly what I found when I pulled up. It looked old but taken care of. Weathered wood, fresh enough paint on the railings, a fire pit near the shore. I liked how far out it was. No cars, no people, just forest and water. I unpacked slowly, letting the stillness of the place sink in. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the lake reflecting the evening sun in a flat sheet of orange. After I put my things inside, I stepped onto the deck and leaned against the rail. That was when I noticed it. Across the water, almost directly opposite me, there was another cabin. Smaller, older, leaning a little to one side. The roof sagged and the porch looked crooked. What caught me wasn't the cabin itself, but the shape in the front window. Figure standing there. I could see it clearly even from across the lake. At first, I figured maybe someone else lived there. It didn't bother me. I waved without thinking, but the figure didn't move. No lights on in the place. No smoke from a chimney. No car or dock or sign of life other than that figure. I stared for a while, then went back inside. I told myself maybe it was some kind of mannequin, or maybe the owner was just private. As the sun went down, I lit a small fire in the pit near the shore and sat out there until the last light drained away. I looked across a few times. The figure was still there, perfectly still, always in the same spot in the window. I tried not to think about it. The next morning, I checked again. The figure was gone. The window was just a dark square now. I felt relieved, silly for even letting it bother me. I spent the day fishing from the small dock, walking the edges of the lake, even took a short trail behind the cabin that led uphill through dense pines. I didn't see another soul. No boats on the water, no hikers, nothing. That evening, as I cooked something on the stove inside, I glanced out across the lake. The figure was back. Same spot, same shape, like it had never left. I stood there longer than I wanted to, staring across. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of someone upright, head level with the window frame, body angled like it was facing me. My stomach knotted a little. I shut the curtains. The rental owner had left a small binder on the kitchen counter with instructions, emergency numbers, and a handwritten note that said cell service was poor, but a landline was hooked up for local calls. I flipped through it later that night and saw a line about nearest neighbor cabins are unoccupied. That stuck with me. I kept thinking about it while I tried to fall asleep, listening to the quiet tick of the old heater. On the third day, I decided to check from another angle. I rowed the little aluminum boat that was tied up on my side, rowing slow across the lake, trying to act like I was just out exploring. As I got closer, I realized how run down the other cabin really was. Shingles missing, porch steps rotted, weeds high around the edges. No footprints in the dirt near the water, no sign of use. The window where I'd seen the figure was empty, just glass reflecting sky. I sat there drifting in the boat for a long while, waiting for something. Nothing. I turned back, unsettled, and rowed home. That evening, it was there again. Same window, same figure. By the fourth night, I felt uneasy enough that I locked every door, shut every curtain, checked each window twice. I sat inside with the lights off, just the glow from the fireplace, and peeked through a slit in the curtain toward the cabin. It was still there. My chest felt tight as I watched. It didn't make sense. If no one lived there, who was it? And if someone did, why never move? Why always just watch? The final night, I didn't fall asleep easily. I tossed in bed, rolling over every few minutes, listening to the groans of the cabin settling. Sometime past midnight, I must have drifted off because when I woke again, the clock read almost 4 in the morning. My mouth was dry, and the air inside felt colder than before. I sat up, half-dazed, and looked toward the front of the cabin. There was movement outside, not across the lake. On the porch, I froze. A dark outline stood pressed close to the glass of the front door, leaning slightly, head tilted down as if peering in. My skin went hot, then cold. It was the same figure, I knew it. Not across the water now, but here. I didn't move for a long time, just staring from the bedroom doorway into the dim living room where the glow of the embers lit the floor. The outline didn't shift, just stood there watching. Finally, I forced myself into the kitchen, where the landline sat on the counter. My hands shook as I dialed the local sheriff's number from the binder. It rang. I whispered into the phone, explained there was someone on my porch, that I was alone, that the place across the lake was supposed to be empty. The dispatcher said they would send someone, but it might take time because of how remote I was. I crouched low in the dark kitchen, phone to my ear, heart hammering. After what felt like hours but must have been minutes, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Red and blue lights flashed across the trees. The figure was gone, just gone. When the deputy knocked, I could barely speak. He searched the porch, the yard, shined his light around. Footprints in the dirt led down toward the trees, not toward the road. He told me later it looked like someone had been moving back and forth between the cabins for a while, watching from across the lake, then circling through the woods. They never found anyone that night. The deputy stayed until daylight, walking the tree line, checking the other cabin. It was empty inside, dust and broken furniture. No power, no running water. But in the dust on the floor near the front window were fresh shoe prints. When I packed up and left that morning, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, miles from the lake. I never went back. The thought of that figure standing in the window for days, then stepping onto my porch in the middle of the night, it never left me. Someone had been living out there in the woods, watching, waiting, slipping between the cabins like a shadow. Not a ghost, not some story, just a person, and that made it worse.